Alright, peace and greetings, YouTubers. Whew, what a day, what a day. Listen, at this point, they're out here just doing any and everything, and they love to continue playing in our faces. And then acting like we're crazy when we call out the nonsense and the foolery. And what you saw happen in Tennessee with regard to Justin Jones and Justin Pearson more so highlights the fact that the United States still operates with a status quo that's centered through a lens of whiteness. And the purpose of that status quo is to uphold and maintain that white power structure by any means necessary. And for those who are offended at that, listen, this is not about your feelings. This is not about how comfortable you are. This is the reality of what it is when we talk about policy, implementation, and what's left when the ink dries. Because what you saw happen to those two is exactly what was left when the ink dried. The ink dried, the two of them were out of there, all because of policy and implementation. That's what we're talking about. So please spare me the Michael Jackson Man in the Mirror lyrics. Spare me the speeches about content of the character and we all bleed the same blood and there's one race, the human race. All of that is ideal. Yes, that's how it should be. However, when we talk about the policy in the United States that has been implemented since this creation of this country, that's never been the case. There's been so much policy implemented specifically because of race. That's why you had redlining. That's why you had folks left out of the GI Bill. That's why you had folks left out of the New Deal. That's why we had housing discrimination. That's why you have job discrimination. That's why you have the flaws that exist within healthcare. That's why we had the zoning laws. That's why you had the laws around heirs land. That's why you had black farmers be left out of the USDA programs. We could be here all day, but policy always backs the conversation about the fact that the United States has always been systemically racist against black Americans. No ifs, ands, or buts. I'm sorry you don't want to hear that. Actually, I'm not sorry. It is what it is. You're going to have to get with reality. Anyway, getting to my point. So to put things into context, there was this massive protest at the state capitol in the state of Tennessee. And this was in response to a mass shooting that had taken place in Nashville a few days earlier. And the craziest part about all of these mass shootings is that, in my personal opinion, I think a lot of Americans have become very desensitized to mass shootings. Just because at this point, they're so normalized. They happen so frequently. It's to the point where sometimes you're watching the news and they're talking about a mass shooting and they have to switch to another story because there's been a different mass shooting somewhere else. That's the United States in 2023. When you look back at, like, I don't know, the era of Columbine, when Columbine took place, it was something that just set and saturated in the news cycle for like 2 or 3 weeks. And it became the go-to reference when we talked about gun violence in the United States. But since Columbine, there have been so many additional Columbines and even things that go far beyond the threshold of outrage and shock that Columbine had, because there have been additional shootings where even more people died, that Columbine is almost like a Sesame Street now, which is a horrible thing to say, but that's the reality of what is in the United States. So you have a lot of people who see that and they feel some kind of way because they recognize that, hey, we have all of these elected officials who are supposed to represent the wants and the needs of the people, and they're not even listening. And so you have this young demographic of people who show up to the state capitol and they say, listen, y'all give a lot of good lip service. Y'all love to do the speeches about how much you care about the children, but then you're silent when the children are getting slaughtered in the classroom. And so the students are protesting, and guess who's out there with them? It's Justin Jones, it's Justin Pearson, and it's also Gloria Johnson, because they recognize that those protesters are also their constituents. And they too feel the same way that their constituents feel. And because they are working against a supermajority, and they recognize that nobody is going to budge on policy, because when we want to be honest, a lot of folks in positions of power when it comes to legislation are bought out. They've been paid off by so many lobbying groups and different advocacy groups where they pretty much pay folks to say, hey, as long as you don't move on this, here's a check. Here's a gift we wanted to give you for your birthday of $800,000. Happy birthday. You know, we're just so happy for you to see another year. So just make sure that when that big bill comes that, you know, you just act like you don't see it, or you vote against it, or vote present, do something. Just make sure you don't push it forward. Do us a favor. And so you have a lot of politicians who operate that way. That's why you have so many politicians, even when we get out of the state level and we start talking about our U.S. Congress, why you see so many of the people elected are multimillionaires. You know, and before they were elected, they weren't even doing any kind of work that even had that kind of money coming in. You know, they were doing a lot of average, everyday, regular kind of people jobs where they're making under $100,000 a year, and now they're worth $20 and $30 million. Okay, that's not coming from being a legislator, all right? So anyway, there's that protest. This is where the fake outrage Olympics kicks in, right? And remember that conversation about status quo? This is where all of this kind of combines and comes together. Somebody like a Justin Jones, who also at one point was an activist, where they too fought against a lot of the injustices that took place within Tennessee. And when we talk about even just the idea of still celebrating the founder of the Klan and all of these different people, Justin wasn't having it. So Justin already had a reputation when he got elected into office. You have Justin Pearson, who as well is outspoken. You have two people who go against the grain, who go against the status quo. they're not just happy to be in the room. They're not going to operate and move in the way of respectability. They're going to go and fight for what it is that they want to fight for the people that they're fighting for. And so that's too much sauce on a chip, right? That's too much dip on a chip. That's not going to fly. And so they need to find a way to get these two out of here. So what do? You all of a sudden pretend that you're so outraged that they showed up with a bullhorn to a peaceful protest, and we're going to now equate that to January 6th. You know what I mean? And so that's what we get. So we get this point where you have Andrew Farmer, who puts in legislation to expel all three of them because he's saying this was just way far beyond the threshold of what was acceptable. That's not the decorum of these chambers. That's not what our state elected legislative, figures do. That's not how we move. Something must be done. And so he puts out this legislation. It goes to the floor, and now they have to debate, and pretty much, the other three have to almost plead their case to stay and keep their positions. And again, the whole idea is what they've done is so outrageous and so dangerous and so detrimental to the livelihood and the credibility of this chamber that they must be removed. Please understand, all of that is some BS. If you honestly think that protesting with some high schoolers and some college students is the same as storming the U.S. Capitol, if you think it's the same as showing up to the U.S. Capitol with weapons and gadgets and helmets and rods and explosives and going in there and defecating everywhere and vandalizing everything and pissing on the furniture and looking for Nancy and we're gonna lynch Mike Pence and if we're successful, we're gonna take over the entire Capitol and we'll run the government. If you think that's the same as protesting against the lack of urgency and the lack of a response by those in power when it comes to implementing legislation that could somewhat remedy some of the violence that we're seeing, then yeah, you're definitely on a cloud that I don't know what you done smoked, but don't pass none of that to me because your brain might be a little fried. So anyway, that's the lane they want to jump in. We're going to pretend that it's just, too spicy, too much. And this is when the acting comes out. This is all of a sudden when everybody has the moral compass of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. Like, okay, whatever. And so in come the speeches. And what was really interesting was watching the other colleagues talk down to Justin Jones and Justin Pearson. The idea of you should even be grateful you're here. That's kind of the energy that they had. It goes back again to a lot of times when black folks get into certain spaces, people think we're supposed to just be happy to be in a room. We're supposed to just do what we're told so we don't lose what it is that we have. We're not supposed to have an opinion. We're not supposed to have an identity. We're not even supposed to align with our blackness if we're being honest. We're supposed to assimilate into what they already created if we want to, climb into that next realm. And so I'm watching them talk down, and the crazy part is as I'm watching this, I already know how this is going to play out. Like, it's no secret that, they're going to expel at least these two. I knew when it came to Gloria Johnson, I was like, I don't know if they're going to expel her or not, but we'll see. I love that Justin Jones highlighted the hypocrisy where he's like, you guys are talking about decorum and standards and trying to claim that I incited violence because y'all wanted to make the claim of one officer being spit on, I guess, in that protest. But then going back to the January 6th thing, it's so funny because a lot of those same politicians in that chamber who were talking about January 6th are the same ones who thought there wasn't an issue with January 6th, a place where actual officers died. I said, what happened to the Blue Lives Matter energy? Y'all supposed to be Blue Lives Mattering and marching and putting on your blue makeup and walking around looking like Smurfs and stuff to fight for the blue lives, and now y'all are all silent. So I love that Justin Jones was like, cut the crap. And he's like, y'all are talking about decorum and everything, but, I watched you all protect a former colleague in his house. And he was talking about David Byrd, who had been accused of sexually assaulting and molesting 3 underage girls. And he got to keep his position. And from what I understand, he was actually, it's acknowledged that, yes, it happened. He got to hold on to his position. They never ousted him. They never had a conversation about decorum, and he got to keep his position. He's saying, in addition to that, we have people who have been charged with domestic violence. They've been knocking their wives upside the head. They get to be here. We have people who didn't like their colleagues and went and pissed in their colleague's chair, smelling up the chamber, making everything all pissy. They get to be here. We have people who are under federal investigation right now, still in their jobs. And so it was so interesting to watch them call that out. But it's also the fact that even with the obvious being right there, they're not budging because, again, at the end of the day, those people get to stay in those positions because they work towards that status quo. Anybody that's working towards that status quo will always be protected. It's the ones who go against it. And so in this instance, again, Justin Pearson, Justin Jones working against the status quo. Gloria Johnson as well in that conversation, somewhat working against that status quo, but they'll give her a little bit of leverage because they still see an element of themselves in her. They don't see that in those two because, again, those two weren't supposed to be there in the first place, if we're being honest. That's how they operate. And so, they expelled the two. And, the thing is, it's a power grab. And like I've always said and what I've been saying as of late, when it comes to maintaining that status quo, 3 of the main things they love to go after are always the idea of attacking education, again, implementing policy, and also inciting violence. So let's just break those 3 down for one quick second. So when we talk about the idea of education, pay attention to what's been happening in the United States for the past few years. As society has become more aware of the reality of what is, as society has become more inquisitive about history, as more information is accessible, as social media has grown, as things are more accessible to everybody and information is readily available all the time, people start to question what has been taught. People start to look at history differently. People start to see the flaws that do exist within the United States. And the problem with seeing that is it challenges the status quo. It makes people want to do something to change it, to make things better. But by changing and challenging that status quo, it also compromises the livelihood of the idea of whiteness in America. And so all of a sudden, there are all of these movements to try and shut down and challenge and restructure education so that that cannot happen. That's why you have this whole idea of the anti-CRT stuff, where at this point, anything that does not gas up and celebrate white founding fathers and leadership must be CRT. Anything taught about somebody who is not white must be CRT. This is why you got them banning AP classes. This is why you have all kind of new rules in regards to curriculums. This is why Virginia in the past tried to implement the hotline where the parents could call in if they think somebody was teaching CRT. That way they could monitor the teachers. You have states that have legislation where parents can come in and sit in the classroom and watch what the teachers are talking about. So you've had all these things. You watched books and curriculums be stripped and changed. We've watched books get banned. We've watched Missouri defund the library system. We have all of these new rules that pretty much attack education because the idea is get people to pretty much just be dumb. Get people to go along with the get along. Get along with the go along. Just go with what is and don't ask any questions. So if you can get 2 or 3 generations to not really see things and go against the grain and they just accept things as they're presented, all should be well. So you have that happening, right? And then even, this is how crazy it is. Even when we go back to that idea of how it can be even implemented with policy when we're talking about education, I look back at Prince Edward County, Virginia, right? Farmville, Virginia. So you have the Brown vs. Board of Education bill passed. Schools now need to be integrated, right? And schools are integrating. Farmville, they don't want to integrate. They said these Negroes ain't coming to our school. So what did? They just closed the whole school system. The whole school district will just close for a few years. So they said ain't nobody going to school. So they literally closed down all the schools for a few years because they did not want black students going there. That's what we're talking about when we talk about like policy and implementation, and even how there's also an attack on education. That's how crazy it is. And so that's why you have all of these crazy laws. And even when you talk about some additional laws, like look at what's happening in the state of Florida, where now, even when it comes to voting, one of the laws that they're trying to push through legislation is if you are a Florida resident, but you're a college student that attends school outside of Florida, you are not able to use mail-in ballot or absentee. You would have to fly back to Florida to come and vote. So if you were born in somewhere in Central Florida, but you decided to go to college in Idaho or Montana or New York or Maine or Utah or Arizona or wherever, when it's election time, no matter what election it is, whether it's something local, whether it's some kind of initiative, whether it's the presidential election, anything like that, no, you're gonna have to fly back to Florida to come and vote. Understand there's a purpose behind that. Even when you talk about what's happening in Texas, where they're pushing legislation where they want to make it illegal to let academic institutions be polling stations, as far as K through 12 institutions like schools or colleges, or universities. They want to put legislation where those can no longer be polling stations. Why do you think they're doing that? Because when you look at the demographics of how people tend to vote when they're in college, they tend to vote a little bit more towards the left. They tend to vote a little bit more as far as what the Democrats are pushing in relation to what Republicans are doing. It's more so opposition. So if we can cut into the demographic of the people that are voting against us, that should give us some leverage. So now you're watching all of that happen. That's how they operate in regard to maintaining the status quo by attacking education, just going after any and everything. And then you also still have the idea of school choice by privatizing the entire education system in this country. That's the move there because, again, money talks. There's money to be made. When you think of the tens of millions of children in the United States that receive public education, if you could make all of public education private, and then it's contracted out, and you have all these developers and business moguls that are now, operating the school systems, there's lots of money to be made. You can also dictate what happens in the classroom, what can also be taught. The Department of Education no longer has a purpose. And so when we talk about attacking the idea of education, that's what we're talking about. Trying to pretty much dumb down an entire generation to ensure that they still go along with the get along in regards to the status quo, as well as other people getting wealthy. That's education. Then we can talk about violence, which is, the one that it's more obvious, it's blatant, it's right in your face. Now, when we talk about violence in the United States, there's so many examples of it. We can talk about what happened during the Civil Rights era, and you want to vote? Okay, go and get the hoses, go and get the dogs, go and get the police, let's burn it all down. And so you watch a bunch of different leaders within the community be assassinated or taken out. All of these different movements that were aimed at trying to better the livelihood and the experience of Black Americans, watch how they just all got taken out. And even when you have the federal government step in and say, what's up, y'all? It's your boy COINTELPRO. we got our eyes on you. So you have things like that take place. Even when we talk about a lot of the race massacres that took place in the United States, there's so many. People always talk Tulsa, we always talk Rosewood, but there were tons and tons. Let me see. You had Slocum, Texas in 1910. Colfax, Louisiana, 1873. You had another one in 1868 in Louisiana. You had another one in Louisiana. You had New Orleans in 1866, St. Bernard Parish in 1868. You had Ocoee, Florida in 1920. I think we talked about that one. You had Camilla, Georgia, 1868. You had another one in Alabama in 1874. You had Charleston, which they actually consider the Charleston 9, 2015. You had one in Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. Atlanta, 1906. Memphis, 1866. We know about Tulsa from 1921. Vicksburg, Mississippi, 1874. Elaine, Arkansas, 1919. Clinton, Mississippi, 1875. Springfield, Illinois, 1908. Chicago, 1919. East St. Louis, 1917. Washington, D.C., 1919. We could be here all day. New York, 1863. Like all of these examples where you have white mobs who go and pretty much destroy and burn down entire black establishments. Entire establishments where black people collectively created their own neighborhoods, their own banks, own schools, churches, businesses of operation, and white folks came and burned it all down. And a lot of times, most of the time, it came from either a dispute around something in regard to policy about some changes that were going to be made, or there's a false accusation. Somebody makes a minuscule accusation about, somebody had been attacked. And so instead of just going after that person who allegedly did this attack, they say, oh no, we're going to respond on a macro scale and just burn your whole town down. When you look at what happened with Tulsa, in addition to not only killing all those people and burning down everything, the people that survived and that were captured then were put in the concentration camps. Pretty much with, for a few months at a time while they were investigated to make sure that they were no longer going to be a threat to the rest of the people in the state of Oklahoma. That's the kind of nonsense we're talking about. So when you talk violence, that's what we're talking about. When you talk about, even the idea of using the police force to pretty much enforce pretty much anti-black ideas, that's the violence that we're talking about, right? And the fact that you've seen so many people fall victim to racial violence and nobody is held accountable. That's the part that's crazy. When you talk about the guy that we just did a video on some weeks back out of Mississippi, where you find him dead in the forest on somebody's property, and his skull has been severed by some kind of machine or some kind of axe or something, and the police say there's no foul play suspected. And the only reason they had to backtrack on that is because there was outrage and people started talking. That's the violence. Again, maintaining a status quo, because if you can implement violence, you can keep people fearful. People won't challenge the status quo. People won't go against the grain. People will be too afraid to say anything, and so people stay in their place. And so that's the other thing. Then when we talk about policy, as far as implementation, that's where the redlining comes in. That's where all of that stuff comes in. That even goes into simple things like, okay, we've integrated, the country. Now you guys have to let black people use this pool. What do you mean black people got to come to this pool? We're not about to let them use it. We'll just drain the pool and fill it with cement and nobody will swim. Policy. That's where we're at in the United States. Just absolute chaos and foolery. And so what you saw happen again in those chambers in Tennessee was using policy to uphold that status quo. Get the two black guys out of there that are, again, they're doing too much. They got too much opinion. They're too confident. They're too assertive. They care too much about their own collective, their own community. They're going to be a problem for us. They're going to get in our way because with the leadership that they have, they're bringing in influence. They have people following them, and it will only be worse for us in the long run. So if we can nip it in the bud now, we don't have to worry about it. That's one of the main reasons why so many black leaders and black movements were taken out when they were taken out. It was because they started to gain too much traction. They started to get too much influence. They started to become too much of a national name. So take them on out, because we don't want people to hold on to those ideologies that go against the grain and the status quo of what you call the white power structure in the United States. And like I said earlier, when it comes to a lot of black people who get into a position where they're in some kind of leadership position, where they're elected or something, a lot of times people want them to go the Clarence Thomas route. You know what I mean? That's when they can do whatever they want. When you can be a Clarence Thomas and be a mouthpiece for white supremacy and uphold that status quo by what it is that you say yes to or what you say no to, sure, Clarence Thomas, no problem. Yeah, sure, I'll strip down Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. That'd be great, sure, because that upholds that white power structure. Now look at what we're seeing in regards to how voting has been attacked and how the rules continue to change and how they're trying to find every way and every reason to pretty much take away the vote from specific demographics because they don't want them to participate, right? Clarence Thomas, how high are you going to jump? That's kind of the move that he's been on. That's the wave he's been on. And so, he gets to get away with whatever he wants to do. So as you see these stories about the corruption and the money and everything, they never get rid of him because, at this point, so many have benefited in regard to that white power structure by his decisions, by him being silent, by him allowing the foolery to take place, by him going against the grain that would benefit other people, but more so support that status quo through a lens of whiteness. And so, Clarence gets to stay, because they asked him to jump and he wanted to know how high. Not only did he jump, he flew. Okay? So that's the kind of folks they want. Not a Justin Pearson, not a Justin Jones, not people who are going to call folks out to their face. And what's funny is you didn't even get to see what it is that Justin Jones and Justin Pearson could even do yet, because they had barely got in there. You know what I mean? And so it's interesting because when you look at the bylaws that they did have, when they're supposed to reprimand their colleagues, it was supposed to be a censure. The censure is more so when, let's just say, something happens on, March 10th of 1999. The people in that chamber say, hey, on March 10th of 99, this took place. These 3 people who are members of our body did that. We don't agree with them, so we're just putting this on paper that, hey, we didn't agree with what happened on this day, and we censured them. That's what that's about. But they say there ain't going to be no censure, not even a suspension, expulsion. Get them up out of there. That's what that was about. And so, they want folks to be like a Clarence Thomas. Somebody like, a Justin Pearson or Justin Jones, that's too much. They're shaking the table too much. And so a lot of times they don't want nobody shaking the table. And most times before you can even get into a position to shake the table, they took the table out of the room, cut it up into pieces, put it into some machine, it turned into some wood chips, they sold it to the pet store, now it's in a lizard cage. Anything to ensure that nobody else has an opportunity to even get into some of the spaces. You know what I mean? And so that's the nonsense. And the other thing that you're seeing now, especially when we talk about policy, is you're also seeing the increase of what you call even more extreme and more irrational policy, where the policy sounds so crazy that you're like, nobody in their right mind would ever pass this, but you're watching it slowly get passed. It's kind of like when you go, let's say you want a raise at your job, you're going to negotiate for a raise. You want, you want a 5% raise, but you're going to tell your boss you want a 15% raise, right? And then y'all are going to negotiate, and it's not going to be 15 that you're going to get. The boss might settle for 11%. So even though you came with this really irrational, extreme number that you knew your boss wasn't going to give you, you still got a little bit of the progress on what it is that you wanted. You may have even gotten more than what you actually wanted. You wanted 5%, you ended up with 11%, and so it's a win for you. And for them, they feel like, dang it, man, now you messing up the bottom line. I gotta restructure some stuff. We're gonna have to cut down on the Christmas party at the company. But yeah, that's kind of what's happening with the policy. And so when we look at how extreme the policy in this country is starting to get in regards to just how outlandish it is, and the fact that slowly but surely little bits and pieces are passing daily here and there, that's what we're talking about. When you have people going against the status quo, then the only way to respond is to become even more extreme, because you gotta put people back in their place. That's the move, and that's the wave that they're on. Now, I will say this. I think a lot of folks think that that's the last you're going to see of the 2 Justins. I think not. If anything, that just fired up everybody. So be ready for more smoke. But I do think you're going to see more of this kind of irrational activity in a lot of different House chambers all across the country, and in other different, fields where there are people that are holding elected positions. Folks, it's only going to continue to get nastier as, society continues to separate even more when it comes to ideals and how they see the world. It is what it is, and at the end of the day, race is at the centerfold. That's what this is all about, maintaining that white power structure. And as other people go against the grain and fight against it, those who want to hold on to it fight even harder. And they also have backing, and they have a larger budget, so it's even more of an uphill battle for those who are trying to dismantle that kind of system. Anyway, share your 2 cents. I'm out. Subscribe.
I'm walking the pathway, leads to my greater. Promising for the next day, nothing can stop me.